Mfia hanum bia betwum. From a bonny be boy Fiachi. Ma ye said insure etni wo esreso. Esanso the offense ya on farm mabio. Ama nkabom ama yentem. Na so obi pese ufife no ode bone maya. Joya no no.
Africa had its own history long before the Europeans came to our shores. But the Europeans came to our shores and because they were attracted by what those who came first found. In our case, it's gold. And the first European establishment, which was established in Ghana, was established at a place called Edna, which they called Elmina, the mine, because gold was so abundant. And they came with their manufactured products in exchange for gold. You know, so the Europeans initially came to our country to trade as partners. It is perhaps the era of the slave trade, which changed the perception of Europeans about Africans when our own people were regarded as commodities.
It's difficult to be precise about exactly how many millions of people were lost. We can look at the kind of repercussions, if you like, of transatlantic slave trade, both for Africa as well as for Europe and the Americas, to see what effect it had overall. But historians tend to think that the population of Africa is much lower than it would have been.
Since we can't get the actual numbers, we can, from looking at population numbers that we do have from some areas, get a general sense of the size of Africa's population and a general sense of the size of those who were enslaved.
Nobody could be absolutely certain about how many Africans were taken. And we need to begin our estimation of this with the understanding that most people, when they do this estimation, think only about the European trade in enslaved Africans. They don't think about the Arab trade also, which was much older. But a closer estimation would be something like 200 million. I've seen this put up, and it's a shocking figure, I know, but I think it's much, much closer to the fact, 10 million. Because those 10 million generally are calculations of the Africans who were landed in the Caribbean and the Americas, who were landed legally. There are many Africans who were murdered indirectly as a result of the activities of the enslavers, some of whom were Africans, especially after a certain point in time. And they were murdered indirectly because of famine, because of disease and so on. These were the direct results of the social dislocation that happened as a direct result of the slave raiding. And we have to begin there. Then there were Africans who died on the march too, the barracoons on the coast. There were Africans who died in the barracoons. There were Africans who died in droves aboard the ships that were used to bring our ancestors to work, in the words of Eric Williams, for lashes instead of wages in these parts, to help to build these shining cities of the dam in which we are so penned up today. And we have to make calculations for all of these.
You tell me to forget that my grandmother was born right there, so all right, I say I shall go. You tell me to forget, it is there I want my own children to grow. All right, I say I shall go. But I hope you understand how
In recent propaganda about the slave trade, you're hearing that blacks in Africa sold their brothers and others, and the whites are not responsible. But you never hear to whom the blacks sold their brothers and other blacks.
The other thing they try to do is make us responsible for our own enslavement. And here they collapse three kinds of people: perpetrators, collaborators, and victims. You can't do that.
There were Africans who collaborated with the Europeans, but there were Jews who collaborated with the Nazis. There will be Iraqis who will collaborate with the Americans. I mean, that is the way sometimes history is.
The Jews are never called responsible for their Holocaust. Only Africans are, you see. We don't say the Jews are responsible because we know in the final end it's the Nazis that killed them, just like we know it's the whites that killed us.
There was no way that millions of people could have been taken out of Africa without African involvement.
So the only way you were going to have a slave trade is you had to have Africans who would go in the coast and bring other Africans out to you.
The fact is also that many African rulers and many African societies tried to prevent the trade taking place. And what has to be remembered is that it started off in a small way and then it escalated over the centuries. So in other words, African societies or African rulers may have become involved in it because initially they thought there was some advantage to be gained. Say, for example, you have some captives in your society, or some people who have committed some offences, or some people you just want to get rid of because they're political rivals. You may have exchanged those individuals for something that you as an African ruler or African merchant thought was desirable, whether that was some manufactured good from Europe or whether it was firearms or whatever it might be. But then having, if you like, entrapped yourself in this trade, it became very difficult for African societies to pull out of it. One of the reasons for that, which historians point to, is what they call the gun trade cycle. That is to say that the most modern, up-to-date military technology was brought to Africa from Europe. If you were an African ruler, it was to your advantage to have that technology, to have guns. Because if you didn't have guns to defend yourself, it may be that the neighbouring society would have those guns and they would come and enslave you.
All of this benefited only one set of people. Not the Africans, it benefited the Europeans.
The majority of the Africans who were kidnapped from the continent of Africa were kidnapped by force and by violence and through warfare. That's how Africans were kidnapped, brought out of their villages, brought down to the coast, and then put on those slave ships. In fact, no African country, no African nation in West Africa ever was a slave economy. No society in Africa had its principal mode of production as slavery. Did not exist. That was only something that the Europeans invented and created.
In African languages, there is no word that means enslavement, when enslavement means what Arabs and Europeans have done and continues to do substantially to African people.
And there was no such concept as chattel slavery in Africa. It did not exist. I know it is said that we enslaved each other. That was not chattel enslavement. That was a similar system. All peoples have had forms of servitude. That was what we had in Africa. And we know that even with those domestic forms of servitude, that there were rules and regulations. It was not about a total denigration of an individual's humanity.
And the sheer horror and magnitude of, in fact, deculturalizing a human being to the point where he or she are simply seen as beasts of burden and as chattel, movable property, are in fact the differences between slavery in West Africa and slavery in the Americas.
In 1789, entitled The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, And Equiano writes about being born in Benin, what is now eastern Nigeria. And he was enslaved along the coastline within Africa by at least 2 families before taken to the coastline and sold to Europeans. And he says in the narrative, he said there was a lot of difference between my enslavement in the interiors of Africa and my enslavement in Europe. He said there is no comparison. He said in the African system, and I'm just quoting Equiano here, in the system, the slave was part of the family. And the indications were that the enslavement was not permanent, much like indentured servitude in England. Equiano says once he's in European hands, everything changed. That he saw the most abominable cruelties he had ever witnessed in his lifetime.
Different ways of killing them. Boiling them in oil, burning them alive, skinning them alive, burying them alive, quartering them, and leaving them for brain dead in the Western Hemisphere. That's why we have to talk about that. Because if we don't talk about it, and we don't talk it in dignity-affirming terms, we'll never be able to deal with it.
This is a slave chamber. Slaves were kept many days of suffocation, starvation, and some tremor. This place was special for women plus children. Women and children keep here in this room, 75 people. But long time, especially for slave, take one neck like this, one neck, another. All of them keep here taking this together, 75 people.
To take somebody away by force from their community is one of the most savage acts you could think about doing. And we can't forget that.
Not just burning some small thatched roof houses, but destroy towns, cities, villages, great works of art, great literatures, and the people that made that art and literature. Songs we would never hear, histories we would never know, art we would never see, because the European had the capacity to destroy and didn't have the moral restraint not to.
I shudder when I come here to Elmina. Some people call it a castle, but it's really the dungeons. And the reason I shudder is because the most horrible things happen here. And I'm most touched. And in fact, the thing that disturbs me most is that right here behind me was a church, situated over the dungeons, and all around this church were dungeons where hundreds of Africans were held in bondage. And on Sunday mornings, you could hear the wail and the moans of the African people combining with the sacred or so-called sacred hymns of the Christian people to produce the most terrible dirges of death you would ever hear. And the African people would always say, as I say even till this day, where was God then? Where was God when all of the horrors that happened here, when the brutality that happened to the Africans happened here? This is the question that must be asked. It's a question that cannot be answered because actually it was human beings who did this.
It's very important that we not only teach that, Africans were picking cotton, and that wasn't the reality of slavery. Slavery was very dangerous, not only for the African, but for the slave master, for the people who dared to enslave other humans. Slavery was a very dangerous business, and resistance was a reality, an everyday reality with slavery. Africans resisted on the ships, they resisted in Africa, they fought wars in Africa, they fought wars in America.
Of course, the image is always given that the Africans themselves acquiesced to the process of slavery. But you'll find that in West Africa, there was a polity or a political entity that existed that guaranteed security right across West Africa, and that was the Songhai Empire. We saw the emergence of Nasiruddin in the 16th century. We saw Malik Si in the 16th century as well, and men like Abdul Qadir and Cherno Suleiman Kaaba. These men who waged resistance in what is known as Futa Toro and Futa Jalon. And then you saw the emergence also of men like Muhammad El Amin and Mamadou Touré. Of course, we had Azinga in the southern areas of Africa as well that was fighting its resistance against European invasion. All the way up until through the 17th century, the emergence of men like Sheikh Uthman ibn Fodio and Umar Futi, as well as Ahmadu Lobo. And then we had the courageous wars that took place in 1884 under the armies of Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdullahi, as well as Muhammad Abdullahi al-Hassan of Somalia. And then we had in 1903, finally, the wars that took place between the Sokoto Empire. So the Africans did not acquiesce to colonialism, nor did they acquiesce to slavery. They fought at every point. And in fact, when the slaves were landing in the Western Hemisphere, in Bahia, Brazil, you saw the emergence of jihad movements. You saw the emergence of men like Muhammadu Sambo, who led a 2-month jihad in the Louisiana territories in North America. Men like Nat Turner and other men who refused to submit to slavery. The Haitian Revolution as well, men like Macantau. So the Africans never acquiesced to slavery. In fact, we can say this here, that the whole concept of freedom that the American 13 colonies had, they got that concept of freedom and liberty from the African resistance movement that took place in the Western Hemisphere.
You look around this world and you find Africans in all of these subservient positions. You're looking at the legacy of enslavement, the legacy of European colonialism, the legacy of white supremacy.
Now, we as a society have been an enslaved society for a longer period than we have been free. It is obvious that the society is still not out of the slave system, in the sense that we still, as a black people, feel that whites are superior. It is more subtle today than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. But there is still a definite impact in terms of how we relate as color groups, color and ethnic groups one to another, how we as a people feel about ourselves, how we regard our own achievements, and what we think about the world outside us.
When we think about a free African being captured to put into slavery, or free territory being captured and harnessed and being colonized, there was a condition that was being perpetrated that turned into a scientific condition that began to put the African through a system that taught him how to hate himself and that which came from himself.
The people are still in slavery around here psychologically and mentally, and the people need to be taught the right things, re-educated around here. And the government and the churches and the pastors take no time off to elevate the people.
After the legal termination of physical enslavement, which many of us mistake for emancipation, Europeans continued to want to dominate and control Africa. By then, they had already put in place mental enslavement. So all they have to do is continue that. And many of us think that we're emancipated, but we're not emancipated. Our actions are determined by the mental prison walls that we continue to inherit.
And specifically for African people, the oppression washed away all remnants of an awareness of the African connection. It was disruptive of family life. It was disruptive of people having positive images of themselves as black people. It affected black people worshiping white in the form of giving black people a religion, the Christian religion, where the Son of God was perceived as white. And so therefore, in the minds, God had to be white. So these are some of the implications of the global system of racism, white supremacy, eventuating in very destructive images within the minds of black people themselves. And because skin blackness was demeaned, then many behaviors reflective of that demeanment have now saturated the minds of people of color, especially black people.
Many writers use the Bible literally to indicate racism and to validate it. For example, one of the most famous and infamous scriptural misreadings is the notion that Ham was cursed by his father Noah, and as a result, Ham's descendants were enslaved, were cursed to be slaves forever, perennially. Those descendants have been defined as black or African, and that curse of Ham or Hamitic hypothesis was used to justify slavery. This is to say, once again, how propaganda was even used at the biblical level to ensure blacks that God approved of slavery for black people and that God meant for black people to obey their masters in slavery and to accept the condition of slavery, if anything, as an act of improvement from the conditions in Africa.
We might think we're done with slavery, but I'll tell you what, slavery is not done with us. We still live in a system that slavery created, and we still define ourselves by that system.
So how do you make a person a slave? You take away their language, you take away their music, you take away their religion, and you give them yours.
Just like there was a process to make a slave and the process to make a colonial African, there has to be another process to remake the African slave in the African colonial mind.
It's foolish to let your oppressor tell you that you should forget about the oppression that they inflicted on you.
Why do we have to talk about the past? Why do we have to talk about identity? And I really think this is a redundant argument now, because it's obvious no people, no nation, no institution or group of individuals or organization ever move forward without considering what they did. That's why we have reports. That's why we have statistics. It talks about what happened before to make a plan for the future. So I don't think that we should feel intimidated to readdress the same question.
Firstly, I say we need to move to slavery, not away from slavery, because we have never fully dealt with slavery. As a nation, as a culture, in our writings, in our history.
In England, every year, they have a Remembrance Day and they wear the poppy and all that kind of stuff, right? There's constant war documentaries. World War I, World War II, whatever, constant. The Jews, they have their Holocaust, they have a Holocaust film or whatever every year. They have exhibitions for it as well, which is endorsed. Now when it comes to us and our Ma'afa and what we've been through, we don't want to remember it. We're told not to remember it.
It's not talked about. Do you understand? They make slavery look like it was no big deal, and slavery is still here within us. It's not over. Do you understand? And you have to define this thing. You have to actually understand the effect of slavery. It's been belittled. Millions and millions of people eradicated, and still they try to eradicate. So how can you say that it's something that needs to be forgotten? It's something which actually needs to be spoken of and taught. Yeah, just as the Jewish people I know about the Holocaust, it's taught, and they're actually told to never forget. So why should there be a difference?
Being here in America doesn't make you an American. Being born here in America doesn't make you an American. While birth made you American, you wouldn't need any legislation. You wouldn't need any amendments to the Constitution. No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism. One of the 22 million black people who are the victims of democracy. Nothing but disguised hypocrisy. And I see America through the eyes of a victim. I don't see any American dream, I see an American nightmare.
So all the ideas about African inferiority, one form or another, which were developed as justifications for the slave trade and for the subsequent oppression and exploitations of Africans under colonial rule and so on. So racism is clearly one of those key problems which has confronted Africans, not only Africans, but the whole of humanity.
It poisons our life condition. It makes people hate us before they even know us. They've redefined us out of humanity so that a person from Iceland got a concept of us and never saw us or interacted with us. Do you understand? So what they've done is poison how we can relate to each other.
The system of racism, white supremacy, in my analysis as a behavioral scientist, as a psychiatrist, is that it is a behavior power system that is local, national, and global, organized by people who classify themselves as white, consciously and or subconsciously. It's carried out in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. It determines patterns of perception, patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, and emotional response, as well as symbol formation.
Honor them when they honor you. Disrespect and disregard them when they vilely treat you. Their arrogance is but skin deep, an assumption that has no foundation in morals or in law.
I think if you are shocked when you go to a country that is predominantly black and you think, wow, black doctors, black lawyers. I didn't know that. That's racism. Because that means, it means you believe the hype, the stereotype, the ideology, yeah? So the knowledge that is fed to you of someone or something, which is completely not true. Just because you are married to someone of a different race doesn't mean that you are no longer a racist. Just because you have mixed race children doesn't mean that you're not racist. And certainly because you're black or mixed race doesn't mean that you're not racist.
Disenfranchised people in the States, they're always subject to like the whims of those in power, you know. I mean, it might not be, you know, getting beat up by a police officer. It could be just being, you know, sort of summarily dismissed from work for no reason, you know. It could be you earning not as much as someone else for the same amount of work. It could be someone not showing you an apartment, not even not giving you the apartment, but not showing you the apartment. I read about this new study where they're doing like voice recognition into people kind of, if you sound black, then they'll just tell you the place is not available anymore. But if you sound white, you know, come on down and have a look. And then they find out you're black and then they're like, oh, it's not.
La population africaine, hein, maintenant, ça va leur intégration va changer, malgré que ça soit déjà intégré, mais ils ne sont pas acceptés partout. Que ce soit dans le milieu du travail, dans l'école, dans l'économie, dans la politique. Il n'y a pas beaucoup d'Africains, je trouve, et je trouve ça dégueulasse. Parce qu'il y a certains pays où ils sont acceptés bien, comme aux États-Unis par exemple, mais en France, ça n'existe pas et moi ça me fait chier un peu, ça m'ennuie.
The Black experience is about what this means to you in everyday life, in your job interview, at university, on the street, when you're shopping, everything about what this means, how you get served when you go abroad. Yeah, how people communicate with you, what opportunities and doors open for you or shut in your face. Is anybody rushing to be that?
What we are seeing in Barbados is perhaps a rapid desegregation in terms of blatant discrimination. Because up to when I was at school, which is nearly 40 years ago, one knew that there was a color bar in Barbados. Barbados was synonymous, as was South Africa, as was Bermuda, for color discrimination. And blacks knew that wherever there was a plantation, you simply did not go there. Where there were concentrations of whites in business, in entertainment, leisure activities, you simply did not go there unless you wanted to work as a menial. Now we have happily passed that stage, but there is still the residual fact that cliques and small groupings of whites can still come together and mask their discriminatory practices in this society by, say, putting up one brown person as manager of a firm or something else like that, and then having an over-concentration of whites in that firm. These firms still engage in a subtle job reservation program, right? So they recruit people from all over the world as long as they're Caucasian. And our government is acquiescent in this, and therefore highly skilled, highly professionally qualified Barbadians are located lower and middle management level, and then there's a glass ceiling which is painted white.
Somebody blew up America. Somebody blew up America! It wasn't the Klan or the skinheads, or them that blows up nigger churches or reincarnates us on death row. It wasn't Trent Lott or David Duke or Giuliani or Schindler Helms retiring. It wasn't the gonorrhea in costume, the white sheet diseases that have murdered black people, terrorized reason, insanity, most of humanity as they pleases. They say, who say? Who do the saying? Who is them paying? Who tell the lies? Who in disguise? Who had the slaves? Who got the bucks out the bucks? Who got fat from plantations? Who genocided Indians, tried to waste the black nation? Who live on Wall Street, the first plantation? Who cut your nuts off? Who raped your mom? Who lynched your pa? Who got the tar? Who got the feathers? Who had the match? Who set the fires? Who killed and hired? Who say they God and still be the devil? Who the biggest only? Who the most goodest? Who do Jesus resemble? Who created everything? Who the smartest? Who the greatest? Who the richest? Who say you ugly and they the good lookingest? Who defined art? Who defined science? Who made the bombs? Who made the guns? Who bought the slaves and who sold them? Who call you them names? Who say Dahmer wasn't insane? Who invented AIDS? Who put the germs in the Indians' blankets? Who thought up the Trail of Tears? Who blew up the Maine and started this?
I'm talking about these people who cry when the sun is standing there in an orange suit. Where were you when he was 2? Where were you when he was 12? Where were you when he was 18? And how come you don't know he had a pistol? These are not political criminals. These are people going around stealing Coca-Cola.
In a city dream, comfort me.
Because the slave ship they have for us is their madhouse and the prison system.
You understand?
There's been no kind of treatment for African people. And we see the results of that every time we take a census of the madhouses or the prisons of the West. African people populate those places in numbers that are far out of proportion to our presence in the population.
You lock up 1.5 million African American men. You can't tell me that you have not perpetuated the institution of enslavement. If you lock up that many brothers and sisters, you have reinstituted the institution of enslavement. Because when they get out of jail, can they vote? Since that's your criteria of citizenship, can they get a good, decent job? Who's gonna help them deal with the fact that they either raped or were raped by someone?
The attack on black males has caused a, what shall we say, destruction of black family life. And when we look at all of the young black males who are caught up in drugs and who are caught up in dropping out of school and in the prison system, I maintain this is because of the destruction of the black father and removing him from a functional role in black family life.
The school system doesn't teach them the truth about who they really are and their full potential. Now, once they know who they really are and their full potential, when they see these stereotypes, they don't connect with them. They don't see them as representing who they really are. So all those images on them in the media are false representations of someone who they are not. But unless they have that alternative frame of reference, if you like, to connect with, they are at risk of being what it is they are told they are.
When you listen to some of our dancehall music and some of our rappers, whatever, okay, we're literally boasting. We're showing the world, look, this is how ignorant I am. You know, I want to drink this amount of whiskey each night. I want to smoke this amount of blunts each night. I want to chase this amount of women each night.
In order for hip-hop records to sell in that number, who is buying it? It is Middle America, it's Middle England. It's the majority white community who are buying these things because they present images of black people with which they are comfortable. They're not comfortable with someone like Common or The Roots or anyone who is playing, you know, authentic, intelligent music, because that doesn't make any sense in racist Middle America or racist Middle England. That's not an image anyone wants to see. No one's going to be comfortable with that. But you have someone with his trousers hanging down his legs, wearing a bandana, holding his genitals, talking about, you know, how he's out on parole. This is something which is very comforting and very reassuring.
All you ever see is bad news. All you see is the negatives. You don't see, you know, anything about African civilizations, African culture, African history. As far as most people in the West know, Africans still live totally in mud huts. When you watch an MTV music videos, you're not watching a music video. It's a multi-million-pound advertising campaign for capitalist organizations which are teaching our young people how to be fools, how to buy and how to consume products that they don't need. It's teaching them, but they don't need any aspirations other than to have a baseball cap back to front, gold chains, that Jeep where they can bounce up and down, and all the other kind of nonsense that keeps them from seeing wider than the targets that have been and the ambitions that have been set forth for them.
When I was younger, we had a sense of responsibility from a very young age. This may be responsible of fetching water, looking after the animal livestock, whether sweeping up the yard, catching some firewood. I think these disciplines that you gain when you're very young, in my time, helped me to hold in good stead when I can become big. Children nowadays, especially in this society, very much a lot of freedom they have. We quieten them by giving them TV or games, things not really encouraging them to do anything but play. And after a while, try to impose responsibility after that. So they hadn't learned this ability of responsibility. So I think that's some of the contribution why we have problems with our children.
And what we have to do is work in tandem with our young people. We've got to stop being afraid of our own children. The African proverb says, Children not taught by their parents will be taught by the world. And the world got some terrible things to teach them. So teach them the legacy of the past. Teach them the great minds, Malcolm and Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, W.B. Du Bois, Martin King, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Sojourner Truth, Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Julius Nyerere, Yaya Sancho. We've got to teach them that and pass it to them as a legacy. Teach them the best of what it means to be African. Teach them Odu Ifa. Teach them Busia. We've got to teach them that. Then that's not going to drop from the sky. And the white man is not going to teach them that. You know what the white man does? He engages in what we call memory replacement. He lifts our memory out and put his in. That's why a lot of times black people can't remember their name. That's why they say the name is John and Stafford, Rachel and Ron and all that kind of stuff. Because they can't remember their name. You ask them what philosophy is in their history. They'll remember the Greeks. They won't remember Amenemope, Ptah. We must recover our memory. We must return to our own history and culture. Until we recover and reconstruct the best of our history and culture and use it to enrich and expand our lives, we'll always be impoverished. And our youth will suffer as a result of that. We must leave a legacy worthy of the name in history African.
There are plenty of black people that would actually punch you in your mouth if you called them black. Black was a dirty word.
If you call someone you old black African, then that was a fighting thing. So again, it's this internalizing this negativity. It's been very, very damaging for young children in our culture and in our race. But where did it come from? That black is ugly, it's not beautiful, that black is evil or immoral, as the dictionary says.
Black, characterized by grim or grotesque satire.
Black comedy.
Black ball.
Black Monday.
Black magic.
Black death.
Black, dirty, soiled.
Black widow.
Black, thoroughly sinister or evil.
Blackboard.
Blackmail.
Black.
The idea is if you just transcend your race, if you just don't speak of your blackness, then you will be fully accepted in the white world. Well, what kind of extremism is involved in whitening your skin? What kind of extremism? If it's okay to be who you are, why not leave yourself as a black person? Why not be accepted for your skin, for your hair, for however you choose to represent yourself? Why is it then that the rule is that you forget about your culture? Don't speak about being black. Don't speak about a difference in your heritage. Then you are rewarded by white society for being equal? That is weird. To me, that is absolutely crazy. That's absurd.
The concept of beauty is coined with us outside of it as black people. Obviously, that comes through history of slavery, our contact with Europe and the rest of the globe. Obviously, Europe is dominant, has been dominant, and has had power over us, not only in our history and so on, but the concept of oneself and how we identify ourselves. So that plays on what we consider beautiful. The problem with that is that this mentality still exists now to this day. And with the forces of globalization and, images and how we can transport images very quickly, the concept of beauty is portrayed onto us, and we idolize that, then we internalize that, and everybody wants to look the same.
I don't know how to move past that. You just have to have more images, I guess, of African Americans and, people from Africa from all over the place, and not have them all look like Halle Berry or Vanessa Williams. I mean, they're very attractive women, but when those are the only types of black faces you see, it doesn't really help. It's just because they're black. It doesn't, I mean, it's really not a diverse image, you know?
And of course, since I'm not considered beautiful, what I would look to is to try to obtain that idea of beauty. And of course, not only does that cause physical pain in terms of straightening our hair, you know, bleaching our skin, but it's mentally, it's very, very, very enduring, and also it plays on your own self and your own self-esteem.
And as the people in Africa and Asia get some power of their own, they get a mind of their own. They start seeing with their own eyes and listening with their own ears and speaking with their own mouth and coming to definitions from their own brain. The European definition now isn't necessarily the definition.
Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education decision ended school segregation, and Thurgood Marshall argued the case. One of the things that worked so well for Thurgood Marshall's case was a psychologist or psychiatrist who had taken young black children into a room and introduced them to black dolls and white dolls. Without any prompting, he would ask the kids, pick up the doll that is prettier. Pick up the doll that is smarter. Which doll do you like the best? Each time the child would pick up the white doll.
Coming from a country where you used to seeing people who look like you in power, I mean, you're used to seeing, like your prime minister looks like you, your treasurer, your, whatever, your head of the army, the head of the newspaper, the head of the media station. I think seeing that instills something in you and helps you to have more confidence in in your own abilities. And I think that's something that people coming over from different countries in Africa and from the Caribbean have that African Americans don't have.
Well, for most of the history of America, black people weren't in a very strong position to define themselves. Economically, they were in slavery up until, for much of the history. We worked in jobs where we didn't have a lot of economic freedom, which meant we didn't have a lot of social freedom. We had our own point of view, but we couldn't impose it on people. That has changed a lot in the last 30 years or so. So there's more black people who have the power to create images of their own. We live in a world that didn't exist when I was born.
So everybody has to, if you like, to understand their history, their past, and the role which culture plays in the lives of human beings. You can't exist as a human being outside of a culture. We all speak a particular language, we all have a particular way of living, lifestyle, and so on and so forth. So these are all, if you like, aspects of culture which are important, but they have to be, they have to be fully recognized for us to really exist as human beings. And I think that's something which is very often being denied to people or devalued in one way or another, as if the cultures of people of African origin, particularly those in the diaspora, but also the continent, are not seen as being as important as the cultures of Europe or the languages of Europe or the institutions of Europe and so on.
It's like the problem is we want to forget about our own ways and then adopt the ways of the West, which is not compatible with our own. So you find out this is why we have a problem, and this is why the gap is getting wider and wider. Because what we are trying to do doesn't match with our own culture, with our own societal norms. So you find out that at the end of the day, we end up failing in almost whatever we do.
If we make a concerted effort to deny who we are as black people and to deny our history as enslaved black people, I think it isn't possible to acculturate fully into a white identity or European identity.
So kids find difficulty, for example, connecting even with the Caribbean if they grow up in Britain. So no, I've got nothing to do with the Caribbean, I'm British and so on. Well, sure, they may be British in terms of citizenship, but in terms of national origin, they have a definite national origin which should be encouraged, promoted. Otherwise, how can they exist as a kind of fully rounded human being if in some way they're always feeling they have to deny their culture and their national origins?
Oh, well, we're fitting in now, we're one society, we're culturally diverse, so we don't have to deal with none of that. But then if we forget about our culture, sooner or later there won't be no need for diversity, because then effectively we're all the same. Where's the richness in that? Because the thing about the world is everybody's different, and you learn to appreciate different cultures. But we seem to be casting off these things because we're in one society now and I want to be like him and look like him. Conformity to that degree is really spoiling our people because we have no boundaries now. And that is what might prove to be the problem.
But you know, our history in the Caribbean has been that of a dualism, because whereas on the one hand we have had the Pan-Africanist sentiment